right. So again, my name is Katie DeFiore, and I'm excited to talk to you guys today about some lessons that I've learned from creating a podcast network. So I want to share a little bit about myself before I get started here. I am the podcast network manager for the Democracy Group Podcast Network, and I graduated from Penn State in 2018 with a degree in journalism. And something that I would like to share about myself that I think is interesting and also relevant to this talk is that I've been described more than a handful of times as scrappy, and I choose to see the positive in that word. And I think the reason that people have called me scrappy is because I've created a lot of my own opportunities through my college experience, and then even after college, I created internships for myself. I created job positions for myself just because I knew that I wanted to gain experience in podcasting, and those opportunities weren't necessarily already available to me. And so I made them available. So I did that through exploiting resources at my disposal. I did that through utilizing my connections to gain those opportunities and that experience that I really wanted. And the reason that I bring that up is because I think that scrappiness that I've been, described to have is my most important trait that I have right now, the most important thing that's allowing me to be successful in managing the Democracy Group Podcast Network. Give me 1 second. Okay. I'm not able to see the questions when I'm presenting, but I guess that's fine.
I can let you know when you have questions. Right now, it's just me.
Okay, sounds good. So I want to share a little bit about the Democracy Group Podcast Network before I start in with the lessons. So the Democracy Group is made up of 12 different podcasts. Our podcasts cover civil discourse, civic engagement, and overall we're exploring the future of our democracy in all 12 of these shows. And we launched in March, the beginning of March actually, so we've only been officially launched for a few months here, but we've made a lot of progress. We started out with only 8 podcasts and we've grown to 12 since then. And something unique about our network is that they're all pre-existing shows. So all 12 of our podcasts are owned by separate entities all across the nation, which I think is really cool, but also poses some of its own challenges, which I'll also go over in this presentation. And before I even get into the lessons, I want to share some of the benefits that I see in being part of a podcast network. Some of you listening might not know what the positive benefits are from being in a podcast network and why someone might want to do that. And so the best analogy that I could find and come up with is an exercise buddy. So if you see this little comic here, it says, "Thank goodness we had plans to run together. Left to my own devices, I'd have convinced myself I was deathly ill." I think something that's really been positive from my experience in being a manager of a podcast network is that I've been able to sort of have a bird's eye view and sort of get this consistent feedback from all of my members about what they're gaining out of the experience. And the number one thing that they've said is this sort of sense of having an accountability buddy, like 12 separate accountability buddies. So when you have a podcast, you obviously have all these goals that you want to reach, all these things that you want to accomplish with them. And sometimes it can be hard to push yourself to achieve those goals. So when you're in a network, you have all these other people who are, I don't want to say like-minded because I think that sort of sounds like you're in an echo chamber, but who have the same goals. They have a podcast, in our case, they're democracy related. And so you can see these people who are growing and achieving their goals every day and in close contact with you, whether that be through Slack or whatever communication channel you have. You're able to see that up close, and so that encourages you to try to make that progress yourself with your own podcast. But in addition to helping you get that extra push, obviously podcast networks have a lot of other positives with them. You get internal cross-promotion, you get guest swapping, audience sharing with social media reach, event opportunities. Once the world opens up again, you can do collaborative events with the people in your network, and then other collaboration opportunities. Something really cool that my podcast network just did was we created 2 separate bonus episodes. Each episode had 5 separate hosts from 5 separate podcasts discussing COVID-19 and democracy and the impacts it's having on democracy and society. And all of those, both of those episodes were dropped on each of our podcast feeds. So it was a really great cross-promotion opportunity. It was an opportunity to continue to get our brand of the Democracy Group out there. And it just gave this really cool opportunity for everyone and all of our hosts to sort of get to see what other people's viewpoints on that topic were.
Hey, I have a question from Andrea Canny. Are you ready for one?
Yeah.
She says, Andrea Canny here, our upcoming podcast, The Rise, examining the rise of the arts and culture community of Central Florida. A long-term goal of ours is to take our format into other communities around the country and possibly world. Is that goal something to be done in a podcast network or more brand franchising? Thanks.
So I think, did she say it was a new podcast?
It's upcoming. I believe they're in production now.
Upcoming one. Honestly, there's so many different things you have to take into account with whether or not you want to join a podcast network and whether or not you want to create one. If you're just starting a podcast and you're talking about starting a network as well, that might be a bit ambitious to do both of those at the same time because those are 2 separate beasts. But if you have a whole bunch of podcasts, if you have a large community surrounding that topic, already created and already built and that structure is already there, then it might be the logical next step is if you already have that community in place. That's sort of what we had, is we had this community of podcasts that were already existent, that were already trading promotions with one another. And so it sort of just made sense, it was just sort of crossing our T's and dotting our I's and saying, okay, we're a network now. And so you get a little bit more of the benefits from it. But if it's not something you already have that structure in and you're just starting a podcast as well, it might be a bit ambitious to take on all at the same time. But, you do you. Does that answer your question?
Yes, she says, thanks for answering my question.
Yeah, cool. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first lesson here. So the first lesson that I learned was to strive for consistency. So these are 3 show logos of 3 shows in our podcast network. And something that you might notice about all 3 of them is that they have this nice little light bulb logo down in the bottom right-hand corner. That might seem like super small and super insignificant, but it's a very important piece to building and maintaining our brand because people inside the network, obviously, we all know that we're a network, but people on the outside don't know that unless we tell them and we show them. So there's a number of things that we do in addition to these light bulb logos in our logos. We also have an audio ID at the end of all of our episodes from all of our shows. What an audio ID is it's sort of like a sound bite, a really short sound bite. So ours says, this podcast is part of the Democracy Group. And we also have a little sound effect that goes along with it that sounds like a little light bulb in the attic turning on. And we use that soundbite, audio ID, at the end of every episode of every podcast within our network. So that's sort of how we continue to show our brand throughout all of our shows, in addition to the light bulb logo. And we have all of our shows have separate websites, and on those websites there's language there saying they're part of the Democracy Group. And then that's also available on each of our shows' social media pages. So it's just really about building that brand throughout all of our shows. And that's what you're doing when you're creating a podcast network, is you're building a brand. And building a brand for a company is usually a lot easier because you own all of the assets involved. But for this situation where we have 12 separate pre-existing shows that are owned by 12 separate companies, we don't own any of the content as a network. And so that just requires a lot more internal communication on my end and on the end of the people who are working in the network, just being able to set forth those sort of expectations ahead of time for what we expect network members to do brand-wise. Let me know if I'm talking too fast. I have a tendency to talk fast. But one of the biggest things with okay, one of the biggest things for striving for consistency is this idea that everyone in your network should have the same general mission, the same general vision for their podcast. So I like to say that we aim for diversity in the perspectives being shared, but a consistency in the overall goals set by our member podcasts. And the reason that I say that is because you can say one mission and one vision, and people will think, oh, does that mean all of your podcasts are identical? Well, no, we all are about democracy. We all are engaging in civil discourse. And a lot of them are interviewing people in the academic world. But we all have, all of our shows are coming at the topic of democracy from different angles, and they have different perspectives, you know. A very diverse group of people, which I think is really essential when you're creating a network, because you don't want to be pushing out the same message with all of your podcasts, but you also want listeners to know what they're getting themselves into when they're listening to a Democracy Group Network podcast or whatever network you may have. And it's also important on an internal side, so that people who are signing up for who are joining your network know what they're getting themselves into. So having that laid out beforehand is super important, so that you know what you're expecting from the people who are in your network, and then the people outside of your network know what they're getting out of your shows. So whenever I'm considering a new show, like I said before, we were originally 8 shows and now we're 12. We've had several shows reach out to us to join our network. And before I even listen to a new show that I'm considering, I go back to our original document that we had created, several months ago when we started the network, that has all of our language written out for what our mission and vision and goal is for this network, so that I have that language fresh in my mind. And then I go and listen to that podcast, and I look at that website, and I look through the people involved with the podcast and see if they'd be a good fit for what we're trying to do. And I think that's a really important process to be able to do, to make sure you're achieving that consistency among your member shows. So the second lesson that I've learned from creating the podcast network is to prepare to be flexible at all times. The first thing that I learned on my job when I started this job back in January was that I'm coordinating 12 different schedules and 12 different more than 12 different people, because there's more than one person per podcast, and 12 different organizations. And so when you're trying to work on all of those different schedules, and you're doing that virtually, which we're all masters at virtual meetings now, but back then it was different. When you're trying to coordinate with 12 different people, you have to realize that even though the podcast network is important to them, they also have a business that they're running, or they also have a university department that they're running, or what have you. They have some other thing going on in addition to this network, which makes their schedule subject to change. And so when you're taking all of that into consideration, it is something to take into consideration when you're forming your network, so that you know beforehand just how flexible you're willing to be, and then laying that out to the people involved. So if for our case, we're of course willing to be flexible with people, because we want to uplift people's voices, and we want to be a resource to them. We're really a resource to the people who are in our network, to help spread the reach of their podcasts. But if your goal for your podcast is to make money or to do advertising, you might need to be more strict with, how your deadlines are working and how flexible you're actually able to be with the people joining your network. So that's definitely something to take into consideration. And just make your level of flexibility clear up front when you're talking to people who may be in your network. And just understanding that some level of flexibility is going to be necessary no matter what, because no matter what you're doing, you're working virtually with who knows how many people, with people who most likely the podcast network is not their first and only job. And so preparing to be flexible is huge. Lesson 3 is have and keep clear goals in mind. So there are 2 key questions to ask yourself when you're starting a podcast network. And the first is, what do you want your audience to get out of the network? And so this is sort of like when you're starting a podcast, right? You want to identify that niche where it's large enough to encompass multiple subtopics, but small enough that it's unique and searchable. So sort of comparing this to what you would do when you're coming up with your podcast, I think for a network, obviously it might need to be a little bit broader because you're not just encompassing different topics for different episodes, but you're encompassing different topics for different podcasts altogether. So that's huge. And for us, we decided that we were a one-stop shop for democracy podcasts, which we thought was small enough to have all of the podcasts in our network be focused on something related to democracy and a perspective related to democracy, but it's also large enough that the shows in our network are not identical to one another, which, as I said before, is really important with a network because that'd be really boring. No one wants to listen to 10 podcasts that are entirely identical. What would be the point of that? So that's definitely a question to consider. And then the second question is, what do you want your podcast network members to get out of the network? So the first one was sort of an external facing question, and this one is an internal facing question. And what you want your podcast network members to get out of it is, it could be any number of things. It could be a combination of a lot of different things. It could be you want to provide funding. You might want to do internal cross promotions. You might want to amplify important stories that the podcasts in your network are sharing. You might want to build community. And like I said, it could be none of these things. It could be all of these things. It could be one of these things. But the important thing to do is to be clear up front with the people joining your network what they'd be expecting to get out of the experience so that they can decide whether or not it'd be the right fit for them to join. Cool. So if there's not any questions at this point, lesson 4 is to use and expand your network. So this is sort of where the scrappiness I was talking about earlier comes in. It's sort of in my life policy that there's no harm in asking questions. There's no harm in asking for things, because what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is that people say no. And it'll sting for a couple of seconds, but beyond that, there's no problem. There's no reason why you shouldn't ask for things. And sometimes you don't even need to ask. Sometimes it's just a matter of sharing what you're doing with people, and then they'll come to you with cool opportunities. So, just sending one email to someone can lead to, and has led to, for us, cross promotions. It's led to discounted paid ad spots. It's led to new network members. It's led to guests for our podcast that we wouldn't think we'd be able to get. It's led to social media interactions that were really huge. It's just, you don't know until you try. And if you think that something could be mutually beneficial for you and the person you're reaching out to, just do it. There's no harm in trying. I'd entirely encourage just going for it. It doesn't matter if that person has a huge following compared to you. They might surprise you. They might reach out just out of the goodness of their heart, or they might think that your mission is really great. So I think it's always worth trying to reach out to people. And the 5th and final lesson here that I'll go over with you guys today is to find workarounds in order to stay on budget and on schedule. So sometimes the most straightforward and obvious answer to a problem might not be the best answer. It might not work for your circumstances, for your team members, for your timeline, or for your budget, whatever it may be. It might just not work out. So I'm going to share an example of what I mean. So for the democracy group, one of the first things that we were advised to do was to get all of our member shows onto the same hosting platform, right? I mean, that makes sense. You know, if all of our shows are on the same hosting platform, we all have access to the analytics super easily. Dynamic ad insertion becomes a lot easier. We're like, cool, that's what we're going to do. And then we started to look into it, and there were a lot of roadblocks that started to come up. Any number of things, you know, from network members having signed contracts with other hosting services to people not wanting to leave their current hosting service, and you know, the list goes on. And so we were starting to panic a little bit because we thought in our heads that this was something that we needed to figure out before we launched at the beginning of March. And that can be a kind of stressful situation to think you have to figure all these things out before a deadline like that. But then we took a step back and thought about it, and we were like, okay, what are the minimum amount of things that we need? What is the minimum that we need to launch this network? What did we want out of the hosting service that now we can't have, but maybe could find elsewhere for free through other services? And we realized what we really wanted was a way to make playlists from like combining episodes from multiple shows, and we wanted audio players that matched on our website. And when we realized those were the only two things that we really, really needed and wanted before we launched, we were like, oh, there's tons of free options, and we don't have to get on a hosting service right now. We can figure that out later. So we found Listen Notes, which is a great tool. If you've never heard of it before, I highly recommend it. You can create podcast playlists, and you can pull episodes from different shows onto the same playlist. So for example, we have a playlist that's called Everything's Just Peachy. It's all about impeachment. I came up with that title. I think it's kind of cool. And it has episodes from all of our member shows about impeachment on that playlist, and then you're able to embed that playlist on your website. You're able to share that on social media, and the playlist comes up right there. You don't have to press a link or anything like that. So that's been a really awesome tool. And then Radio Public has really nice free audio players that you can put on your website, and that's really easy. You just submit your show's RSS feed, and then you gain access to those embeddable players. So we solved the problem for free, and we did it before our launch on March 4th. And now we're starting to delve back into solving the problem of getting everyone on the same hosting platform. But now we can do it on our own schedule and on our own budget, which works out a lot nicer. So I guess the lesson there is just do what makes sense for you with what you have and the timeline that you have. And don't feel like you have to meet some sort of standard, because I mean, everyone's sort of figuring it out as they go. So do what makes sense for you. I think I skipped a slide. Yes. So overall, a podcast network is a commitment, and building one is quite the adventure. I'm still figuring it out, what I'm doing as I go. I continue to learn and adapt to the needs of my members as we go. We have 12 shows, as I said before, so it's still a process of me learning all the needs that all of those individual shows have and adapting to those needs as I continue to grow the network. And on a personal level, I've really learned so much just skill-wise. My organization skills are like so much better than they were before. My marketing skills are up. I'm so much better at doing internal communication because of this network. And it's just been a really awesome and exciting opportunity to be able to build a positive community around podcasting and democracy. So it's been a really awesome ride so far, and I look forward to the growth that we're sure to see in the future. So thank you for coming to my talk today. I highly encourage you to contact us. This is the email and website for the Democracy Group, and my email and website. Feel free to reach out with any sort of collaboration ideas or questions. Yeah, that's my talk.
Good job.
Jada, we have a couple questions. I'll ask this first before we get to some of the other questions that are coming up in the chat.
Yeah.
What has been other than maybe monetizing the podcast network right away, what has been the biggest challenge?
Oh my gosh. There's been a lot. I'm trying to think what was the biggest one. I think the internal communication aspect has been the biggest challenge. I touched on that earlier, is just having to try and keep everyone on the same page constantly, because I'll come up with an idea for the network, or my boss will come up with an idea for the network, and then we'll start doing it, and then we'll realize that we have to tell everyone before we start doing something, because it impacts all 12 shows. And then it just sort of has to go through that process of like approval almost from everyone, which like I said before, there's definitely positives to having 12 separate shows with 12 separate ownership, but it's definitely a challenge to sort of coordinate between all 12 of those people.
I bet. Good luck with that. I'm sure that takes a lot of work, a lot of organizational skills, right?
Yeah, it's a majority of my day. And spending a lot of time organizing Google Drive folders has become my pastime.
Another question here, is your goal to grow the number of members of the network, and to what?
So we have several goals. We definitely want to grow the number of members in our network, but we sort of grew faster than we expected to on that front. And so we're trying to focus on building up our promotions right now, externally promoting our network, so that we can do more to grow the audiences of our individual shows. Because that's the ultimate goal, right, is to spread the messages as far as we can that are being shared in these shows. And to do that, you have to have bigger audiences, and that's sort of the goal of the network, is to grow everyone's audience. And so the method for that is doing a lot of promotions with external organizations. And so that's what we're focused on right now. But people continue to reach out with interest to join the network. And so that's definitely one of our goals, is to continue to grow in that way.
So what's the business model behind it? For our network, right, we have a specific business model, but we've noticed that a lot of different networks have different business models, and some aren't really a nonprofit type of a organization, but they're acting like a nonprofit. So what is it for you guys?
It's hard to categorize. So basically, our goal isn't really to make money, so we're not filed as any sort of nonprofit or anything like that. Technically, the Democracy Group is owned by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State, which produces the Democracy Works podcast within our network. And so it's owned by that, but that's just a department within Penn State. And so, we're not technically any sort of official filed business per se, and we're not trying to make money by any means.
Makes sense with what you're doing and the message that you have. I like it. Anybody else before we say goodbye to Katie? Yeah, it looks like you did a great job. Obviously, you have your last page was your contact information. So can you put that up one more time if it's easy to put up?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
What do you think overall podcast networks, do you think that more people should be part of podcast networks? Are you an advocate that all podcasts should be a part of a network, or is it on an individual thing? Or, basically, are you a network evangelizer, or are you like, this works for me, maybe not for other people? Sorry about the pings.
Oh, that's okay. I think I'm with the latter there, that it's something that can work for some people, but not everyone. I think because it's sort of with what I was saying before about finding that niche and understanding that your niche has to be a little bit broader in order to be a network. If your podcast is super specific and has like a very loyal but maybe smaller community, a network might not make sense for you, because Well, it might make sense. So I can't say that, for every situation. It really depends on the infrastructure, I think, that you have in place. If you have a community of other podcasts that are doing the same thing as you and have a similar goal and an overall mission, then I think, then a network makes a lot of sense in order to uplift your podcast and grow your audience. But if you don't have that sort of community in place and you don't have those people who are doing similar things as you and what you're doing works for you already, I don't think you have to by any means. I think you can be super successful as an individual independent podcast. It's definitely getting harder to do that, I think. And it's been difficult to do that because of, a lot of podcast search engines make it really difficult to find those smaller independent podcasts. And so if your podcast isn't coming up in everyone's search engines, then you're more likely to come up with people's searches if you're part of a network. But obviously that's something that you have to have the capacity to commit to. Like this network, I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but it definitely needs a manager. Like my role is important because without someone doing the managerial stuff, you need someone dedicated entirely to managing the network, or else it's not gonna it's gonna be really hard to grow.
And then one more question before we wrap up.
Yeah.
What is your ultimate wish list? Who would you love to have as part of the Democracy Group?
Oh my gosh. That's so hard. I don't even know if I've thought about that. I mean, we were super hyped to get, not that I'm not hyped to have all of our shows in our network. I love all of our shows, but we were super hyped to get 70 million in our network.
Yeah, that one's amazing.
They were just nominated for a Peabody Award, and we're like, they're in our network. But I'm trying to think who else would be great in our network. Honestly, I don't know if it's a specific.
Pantsuit Politics, says somebody in the chat.
What did they say?
Pantsuit Politics.
Yes. That was probably Jenna. We're trying to get them in the network. We would love to have Pantsuit Politics in our network. We'd love to have a lot of different shows in our network, but that one would be great. I think, honestly, it's not a specific show, but just a description of the perfect ideal show is someone that adds diversity and perspective to the ones that we already have. Someone who's coming at things from a different angle than all of the ones that are already in our network would be awesome.